Each year, a growing number of people are stricken with a rare neurological condition called Shy-Drager syndrome, also known as multiple system atrophy or SDS-MSA. As with any rare condition, there are only a few hundred physicians and researchers familiar with SDS-MSA. Because there is little knowledge in the medical community about SDS-MSA, patients and families struggle with enormous, complex, and daunting challenges. The reality of living with Shy-Drager is that the afflicted patients and their families find themselves on an unpredictable and life-altering path, negotiating challenges they never could have imagined. With this presentation, the SDS-MSA Support Group, to which you'll soon be introduced, hopes to broaden the circle of knowledge necessary to offer a higher quality of life for its members and expand the body of support necessary to meet its mission and goals. Shy-Drager syndrome is a chronic, degenerative illness with no known cause or cure and very little available to treat the long-term systemic impacts caused by this illness. There has been some research conducted to better understand the common nature of SDS-MSA. At a recent support group meeting, some of the nation's top SDS-MSA researchers and physicians presented the latest in what we know about this illness to a group of patients and caregivers.
Shy-Drager syndrome is a syndrome that is characterized by autonomic failure that affects major systems such as blood pressure control, so the blood pressure plummets when the patient stands up. There is impairment of bladder control and to some degree bowel control and sexual function. On the neurologic side, patients have a form of Parkinsonism or a form of cerebellar involvement so that their balance, their speech are impaired. The term degenerative is often used. It's a rapidly progressive condition involving multiple systems. That's why it's called multiple system atrophy. When you study parts of the brain, those relevant parts are progressively atrophic.
As you know, the cardinal features are the Parkinsonism, the slowness, the stiffness, autonomic dysfunction that others will talk about in greater detail later this morning, but the problems with blood pressure, urinary control, etc. And then the cerebellar dysfunction, the problems with coordination, walking, using the hands. And in 1989, a group led by Peter Lantos in London identified the cardinal neuropathological feature of the disorder, the glial cytoplasmic inclusions in oligodendrocytes. As some in the audience may know, there are a number of cells that make up the brain, but quite simply, they're the nerve cells and another type of cells, the oligodendrocyte. It makes that insulation that goes around the nerve processes. And they identified the changes in these oligodendrocytes. And this discovery, the patients with these various syndromes, OPCA, Shy-Drager, striatal nigrodegeneration, they all had this pathology. And so it really verified the notion that these syndromes are manifestations of the same process.
I feel that people need to know about it probably more from an emotional standpoint than a logical standpoint. If the public knows about it, they can understand these patients and not ignore them. If the public knows about it, there will be more willingness, perhaps, on the part of the public to support the patients and the research and the support group. Without the illness and its symptoms and its end being made public, we're lost. We're like lost children in the heart of a woods without a search party because nobody notices that they're missing. The illness strikes at the average age of onset at middle 50s. By this time in a person's life, they have a small cluster of associates. They have their children and their very close friends, because that's what children do. They focus your whole being on them and a few friends who are in the same situation. We have no poster children. We have nobody of any notoriety who has ever had this illness to draw attraction to it. Therefore, we have to work harder to make ourselves known. The patients can't do that. I'm healthy, I'm determined, and I will work harder to make sure that our patients are not ignored, neglected, or forgotten.
Because of the dedication and strength of many SDS-MSA patients and their families, caregivers and doctors, there is a growing body of knowledge that has the potential to improve the day-to-day quality of life of all those impacted. In fact, as an outcome of a unique partnership between researchers, physicians, and many struggling patients and their families, the Scheidegger Syndrome Multiple System Atrophy Support Group was born.
Dorothy Traynor Kingsbury really is the one who got it started. And she and I communicated. I had never met her at that time. She was in New Mexico. And we communicated and decided to get patients with this disease together. They had never been together before. And so when we met the first time, I guess that was about 1988, I don't believe that a patient with MSA had ever met and had a chance to talk with another patient with it. And so that first meeting, that was one of the most emotional experiences I've ever had because of so many people together talking about their difficulties, and their successes and failures at the same time.
Right.
At the end of that first meeting, there was no physician, I think, there, and no nurse whose eyes were dry. We were really profoundly affected by this as well as anyone else. And so we resolved that there was never going to again be a time when people didn't have the chance to get together. And so Dorothy Traynor Kingsbury and Dr. Sterling Edwards, who was a former chair of surgery at the University of New Mexico, they continued working with us on that for several years. And out of this group, the American Autonomic Society, of the physicians coming to this support group, the American Autonomic Society developed. So it's a case where a professional organization developed from a support group, the Scheidegger Support Group. You might expect things would work the other way, but this is where the support group spawned the professional organization.
The SDS-MSA Support Group exists to gather and disseminate information amongst each group of people involved: patients, caregivers, family members, and physicians. Awareness building has resulted in an increased focus on SDS-MSA research and has expanded the network of physicians educated in diagnosing and treating SDS-MSA patients.
I want the support group to be able to be there. They probably would all hesitate to call me at midnight with some terrible incident, but many of them will call me the next day and say, this is what happened. And I can say to them, in most cases, don't be frightened. That's what happens. And this is how you reduce the possibility of happening, or this is how you behave when it does happen. This is what you do to make your patient, your loved one, more comfortable.
Excuse me. I've noticed in listening to the patients and caregivers that they're also enormously educated about this disease. Does this support group offer that as well? Is just a place to get information about?
Yes, yes, the support group does offer a source of information through the website, through our brochures, and through the email group. The email group is an unusual bunch of people. There are approximately 800 to 1,000 people on an open party line type email system. If somebody has a problem, they can put a query out onto that email system, and within an hour they'll have numerous replies as to how other caregivers or patients have handled that situation. The Scheidegger Multiple System Atrophy Support Group is made up of a group of people who all suffer from basically the same illness. They're either caregivers, family members, or patients. I hope that I can bring information from one patient to another, from a family member to another, from patients to family members, and from patients and family members to physicians, so that we have built a freeway, if you would, a circular freeway for information to flow freely and constantly around this circle, so that nobody gets left out, and so that everybody gets the same information. The information that we have as patients and caregivers, and many times, is information that we have discovered, ways and means of giving comfort to the patients. We must be able to distribute this information around the whole circle. Physician, patient, caregiver, family member, physician. It must circulate so that everybody is covered by all the information that we have.
The initial challenge for someone experiencing possible symptoms of SDS-MSA is receiving a proper diagnosis. Due to the experience of those in the medical community who have been presented with patients exhibiting Shy-Drager symptoms and the real-life experiences of patients and caregivers who have lived with the disease, there is a better understanding of the common and related symptoms and their presentations. That knowledge can lead to an appropriate diagnosis.
I have an opinion as to whether there are many with this illness that are not diagnosed because the doctors don't recognize the illness. I can't say that I know this, but I strongly suspect that we have in the neighborhood of 100,000 patients with the illness in the United States right now. We know of approximately 20,000 of them that are diagnosed. That means that 80,000 people in the United States are ill, and nobody has been able to identify the illness or give them the proper medication to make their lives a little bit better.
Perfect.
Think of the blood pressure drop and reduced blood flow to the head as causing lightheadedness. But as Dr. Low mentioned, there are many other symptoms, such as a patient who's just appears a little confused and glassy-eyed, and they may not say they're lightheaded, yet indeed their blood pressure is low enough that it's affecting their the speed at which they can think. They may slow down further. They may mumble, and those are symptoms that sometimes, if you see that mainly in just the standing position, in fact, it may be due to low blood pressure. Because of the incoordination and the gait problems, low blood pressure will add to the risk of falling. If you get low blood pressure, again, you're slow down, you may trip more easily than if your blood pressure is maintained. So it is a very important thing, even though you may not actually be blacking out. Many MSA patients have never actually blacked out, but they have come close many times. MSA, we not only worry about or think about the low blood pressure when you're sitting or standing up or after a meal, but we also are concerned about the high blood pressure. The high blood pressure is part of the disease. In other words, it's not just because you're trying to treat the low blood pressure, it's part of the disease. Virtually all patients with MSA, even untreated, when they lie down, their blood pressure will be elevated or in the slightly hypertensive range. When they lie down at night, the blood pressure, instead of going down, rises and stays elevated throughout the night. This is part of the condition.
In terms of onset of the condition, it is usually ushered in either by autonomic symptoms, so that some patients begin with autonomic symptoms such as bladder failure or orthostatic hypotension. Sometimes a patient will present to the urologist complaining of difficulty with their bladder, and after they have prostate surgery they find they are no better. and then shortly after that they discover they have neurologic syndromes of Parkinsonism or cerebellar involvement. Now, this situation can sometimes be even more complicated in that there are some patients who present with autonomic failure alone for some years and then later on develop the neurologic syndromes. So that early on they're often diagnosed as pure autonomic failure.
If we're going to treat this symptomatic orthostatic hypotension, what do we at least hope to do? Well, we want to support that blood pressure enough so certainly we don't have our patients blacking out, if at all possible, and the low blood pressure contributing to falling. We want to maybe take that standing time from 30 seconds or less, and we're happy even if we can demonstrate the patients can stand for a minute. They can do so many more things. They're going to tell us, you know, hey, I can now stand and brush my teeth or whatever. We want to be able to increase the blood pressure enough so that we can then, in some patients who have mainly Parkinson's symptoms, perhaps early on in the course of their condition, we want to be able to see if we can help their stiffness, help their slowness, help them get up out of a chair, turn in bed better with the Parkinson's medicines. We all know that MSA patients just don't respond very well or as well. But I think we all have had a patient or two that has some response to those drugs, at least in the beginning of their condition. And to not be able to use it because of the excuse of the blood pressure is already too low, well, I don't buy that anyway. And finally, we want to make sure our treatments do not produce other problems, such as prolonged hypertension, although it's very rare to get a hypertension-induced brain bleeding or hemorrhage in the brain. That does happen. It puts a strain on the heart also to have the blood pressure up during the night. And so we don't want to encourage that, and so we have to be wise in our current treatments and as Dr. Low has pointed out, in our future drugs that we use to try to devise treatments that don't put the patients at greater risk due to hypertension at night.
It cannot be overstated how difficult it is living with SDS-MSA. The disease is progressive in nature. Patients must learn to expect that their body will slowly shut down and stop functioning. From losing the ability to walk and move around independently to ultimately losing all ability to communicate, SDS-MSA slowly eliminates one's ability to function normally. Families and caregivers are challenged to care for a loved one and patient whose symptoms or physical condition can change dramatically from one day to the next.
Early on, it was not so much caregiving for my wife as it was finding a diagnosis. During the first 5 years that she was ill, we saw 28 doctors in the state of Texas, had multiple tests and even a major surgery done, which turned out to be unnecessary, and we still had no idea of what was wrong. After we went to Vanderbilt University and found out what her illness was, it seemed almost easier to be a caregiver knowing what we were facing. The illness progresses in such a way that a caregiver has to learn virtually every week something new that he has to handle. With the help of doctors, knowledgeable doctors from that point on, I learned what I needed to do and how to do it. Each one was a challenge. No challenge was larger or smaller than the other, but there was a new challenge every week to month, 2 or 3 months, that had to be met and handled. And I suppose, if anything, it was good that those challenges only came in spans. The disappointment came early when we got her diagnosis, because we'd been, as anyone at that time in their lives, I was approaching retirement, and we had dreams of what we were going to do. The disappointment went away as I accommodated emotionally. The fears happened in the middle of the night when something new would turn up that I hadn't seen before. I'd have to learn another procedure or another means of making her comfortable. I have a very strange, compared to others perhaps, I have a very strange response to all this. I took care of my wife for 5 years after her diagnosis, and I got frustrated, of course. I even got angry and shouted at her, but those things all passed, and I got through them by apologizing and crying and holding and all that stuff. But the one thing that I see, the greatest thing out of all that was I had 5 long years to tell my wife goodbye, and that was a real blessing.
There has been limited but significant research-based breakthroughs that have led to a better understanding of SDS-MSA. Because of these breakthroughs, the medical community has a better understanding of what symptoms to expect from initial onset. In addition, there has been a limited number of treatments for those symptoms. In fact, today there are improved methods for better diagnosing SDS-MSA.
It has also been possible to diagnose the patients with a lot more accuracy. Some of these have been based on studies, for instance, that have come from a different approach. For instance, the British Brain Bank study were based on brains of patients who were diagnosed in life as having Parkinson's disease. They found that approximately 1 in 5 patients in fact had multiple system atrophy.
I hope that the research community will focus both broadly and narrowly. The research is apparently the current research is apparently aimed at genetic or environmental causes. I feel that neither one of those will be totally the case. I think they're going to find the causes of the illness in scattered places. I hope they don't get too broad in their search.
I think there are lots of ways we can go about trying to find the cause of this disease. One way is simply to study the genome very carefully, look at candidate genes that we think might be contributing to the disease. Another way is to develop animal models, particularly with mice. We can take a gene and knock that gene out of a mouse. That is, give that mouse a defect in that gene, and then see if there's anything about that mouse's health that resembles what we see in this disease. We're finding that's a very productive way to go as well. And then trying drugs of different mechanisms to see what seems to help. That's yet another way we can go about trying to understand the cause. And I think all 3 are working together. And then at this meeting that we're at right this moment, we also have heard from Dr. Schultz about the value of questionnaires and assessing people, asking lots of questions to see if any correlations come out that could help us further. It's very important that we focus on this disease in and of itself. Now, we can benefit from spillover research that's done for Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's and other diseases, but we mustn't lose sight of this disease because it will be different from the others in their cause, even though the causes may be related in some ways. This one will be a little different, and this is a really tough one. This is not a disease for weaklings. This is a very tough illness. And so we need all the help we can get.
Any person or family dealing with a serious illness has an immediate need to connect and work with a knowledgeable doctor. Because of the progressive and ever-changing nature of SDS-MSA, such a relationship is even more critical.
Focusing on the importance of an integrative approach to the diagnosis of this condition, this is an extremely important question. Many patients indeed are seen by subspecialists in certain areas, and they fail to put the condition and fail to make the diagnosis of MSA for a long time. The example I had cited earlier was a patient seeing a urologist for either erectile dysfunction or bladder problems. But sometimes it's even experienced physicians, such as neurologists, may recognize the striatonigral or the Parkinsonian part of the syndrome or the cerebellar part of the syndrome without pursuing the autonomic side, and therefore failing to put together a diagnosis. Another example are patients who see their cardiologist because of orthostatic hypotension, and then only later on see someone else who recognizes that there is also an autonomic and neurologic syndrome. It is very important that physicians have an integrative view. In order to approach that, they need to recognize that when you have autonomic failure, it can occur alone, but very often it occurs in association with other syndromes, and it's that recognition that leads to the correct diagnosis and treatment.
It's very important that the physicians and the caregivers be on the same plan. Also, not all physicians can know a lot about every rare disease, and this is a rare disease. In medical school, people might discuss MSA only 5 minutes. So that's the training that our physicians get. So everything else they must learn in other ways. And so we felt that the patients together, interacting with physicians who've seen a lot of patients with this, could carry out the message and help other patients. It's important because for those who have it, it's crucial that ultimately the correct diagnosis be made. Now, having said that, I should also point out that early on in the disease, many people will be told that they have Parkinson's disease. And then maybe 2 years later, the physician will say, well, you know, I think it's not just Parkinson's, I think it's probably Shadrager or MSA. And the patient should be understanding of that, because none of us experts at this meeting, if we are experts in MSA, none of us always get it right the first time. And so people who were given that Parkinson's diagnosis early on shouldn't feel that their physician was bad. And also they shouldn't feel that it's very likely they've missed much advantage, because early on the treatments are quite similar for the two illnesses.
Right.
The first point in speaking to a doctor or a group of doctors about this illness would be to not focus on one symptom. You must look at the package of symptoms. That was the primary thing we had. The second one is that they really need to give our patients time to talk and listen, because the patient can transmit his or her feelings far better than any examination can discover that feeling. The third would be to plan to be in touch with that patient in the future. Please make yourself available to talk to them on the phone. Even though they don't have an appointment scheduled, they may have something critical to them to ask you about that won't take but a few minutes of your time, but will help them immeasurably.
While many of those dealing with SDS-MSA will tell you that finding hope in the midst of dealing with this life-altering illness is difficult, there is a collective belief that if given enough resources and support, a breakthrough in research and treatment is possible.
In terms of where we are and looking at hope for the future, I think that the fact that we have made progress over the past 10 years, so that today we have attained a number of small steps that does enhance the quality of life of patients. These include the segregation of patients into less severe versus more severe categories, the provision of better treatment for the orthostatic hypotension and other forms of autonomic impairment. The bigger hope for the future is the fact that we are serious about going after environmental and causes in the genes, and finally that we think that we have a molecule of interest in the alpha-synuclein gene.
When you have a disease for which you don't have a cure, and your treatments are not very good either, even in forestalling it, sometimes the support that you can give to patients and families, the human interaction is one of the most valuable things that you can do. And I would say that there was no event that was more transforming in my life than that first Scheidegger Support Group meeting and the emotional dynamics that grew out of that. I believe that changed my life and my career and made me more dedicated than ever to trying to find a cause and cure. It's possible that someone like one of the Scheidegger people who presented at this meeting might make the crucial discovery. But it's also possible that someone doing something totally different will make the crucial observation that we will then be able to translate into that. So you can never tell where the great breakthrough is going to come from. I would say the odds are that the big breakthrough will come from someone who doesn't think of himself or herself as an MSA expert.
From those who have pioneered research, diagnosis, treatment, and caregiving of patients with SDS-MSA, we know that those families who have struggled or are struggling with this illness are blessed with an amazing grace, a life of dignity, and an overwhelming amount of love which often offsets the day-to-day struggles. The personal stories of those who have gone through this illness or are struggling with this disease today are always encased in an awe of the blessings they experience while living through such difficulties. The intent behind the production of this video has been to raise awareness of Scheidegger syndrome multiple system atrophy. Our experience, strength, and hope demonstrates that there are many communities who must be engaged with the countless aspects of this illness. The SDS-MSA Support Group continues to consider how best to bring together the communities involved in this illness to foster science-based knowledge, expand and improve medical and pharmacological treatment, and offer the most comprehensive level of support to SDS-MSA patients and their families and caregivers. For more information on SDS-MSA and this support group, or if you'd like to help us expand the reach of this critical effort, please visit our website or call us at 1-866-SDS-4999.